Financial commentators love letter-based analogies. As you might remember, during the pandemic, everyone was hoping for a so-called V-shaped recovery, with the economy swapping back to pre-pandemic strength, instead of, say, a U-shaped recession, where things take a bit longer, or even a dreaded L-shaped recession, where the recovery never really happens. More recently, however, there's been a lot of talk about America's allegedly K-shaped economy, defined by a growing inequality between the haves and have-nots. So, in this video, we thought we'd take a look at this idea and try our best to figure out whether the US economy really is K-shaped, or if we've all just been suckered in by a dangerously cute letter-based analogy. We've just released a new coffee table book called Assembly Required, which runs through the stories behind some of the world's most beautiful parliament buildings. It's 300 pages long, features hundreds of photos as well as custom designed floor plans and maps, all alongside the stories of each building written by our team. Find out more and pick up a copy by clicking the link in the description. So what do we actually mean by a K-shaped economy? Well, the basic idea is pretty simple. It's an economy where the rich are getting richer, hence the top line of the K going up, while the poor are getting poorer, hence the bottom line of the K going down. The term was really popularised after the pandemic by an economist called Peter Atwater, who noticed a post-pandemic divergence in sentiment between rich and poor Americans. However, it popped back into the headlines a couple of months ago when, in their quarterly reports, a number of big US corporations noted a divergence in consumer behaviour. High-income consumers were continuing to spend, but middle and low-income consumers were paring back. McDonald's CEO Chris Kempczynski, for instance, said Mackey's was seeing a quote bifurcated consumer base, with traffic from lower-income consumers declining nearly double digits in the third quarter, while growing by roughly the same amount among higher-income consumers. Chipotle's CEO said he was seeing something similar, and Coca-Cola's COO said its new mini cans, which you can now buy as single units in the US, were about trying to reach these poorer consumers who were tightening their belts. This idea of a K-shaped economy has since become popular, both because it apparently chimes with the experience of many ordinary Americans who feel like, whatever the headline numbers say, the US economy is pretty rubbish for anyone except the rich right now, but also because it explains some of the apparent contradictions we're seeing in the US data right now. Why consumer sentiment, for instance, is at rock bottom, even as consumer spending keeps coming in above forecast. So that's the idea, but is it actually true? Well, if you just look at the headline numbers, it doesn't really look like it. The US has always been a remarkably unequal country, but it hasn't become much more unequal in recent months or years. According to Federal Reserve data, for instance, wealth inequality in the US hasn't really changed since the pandemic. In fact, the top 0.1% and bottom 90% have all seen their share of national wealth slightly increase in the past 5 years, at the expense of the top 10%. It's a similar story if you look at income rather than wealth. Again, the US has always had a remarkably unequal income distribution. The most common measure of income inequality is the so-called Gini coefficient, which runs from 0, a perfectly equal distribution of income, to 1, a maximally unequal distribution of income, with everyone earning 0 apart from one person who's earning it all. According to the most recent World Bank data for 2023, the US had a Gini coefficient of 41.8, by far the highest in the G7 and the highest in the OECD apart from Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico and Turkey. But this isn't new. Save for a brief dip after 2008 and the pandemic, America's Gini coefficient has hovered between 41 and 42 for the past 20 years. Furthermore, while the World Bank doesn't have data for 2024 or 2025, distributional income data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta suggests America's Gini coefficient basically hasn't really changed in the past 2 years. To be clear, we're not saying this is a good thing. Rather, we're saying that the US has always been an incredibly unequal country, and, according to headline figures, it hasn't become much more unequal in recent times, which is what the K-shaped analogy implies. However, that's not to say all this talk of a K-shaped economy is merely catchy nonsense. If you dig into the data a bit more, you can see the occasional K-shape, most obviously in the labour market. Only a couple of years ago, the US labour market was great for lower workers. A post-pandemic hiring spree meant lots of jobs and remarkably strong wage growth for low-income workers, especially if they moved jobs. However, in the past couple of months, that's all changed. The US is now stuck in what's sometimes known as a low-hiring, low-firing jobs market. The low firing bit has kept the unemployment rate low, but the low hiring bit has meant weaker wage growth, especially for the poorest quartile of workers, who are now seeing lower wage growth than everyone else, and meant that most workers are now better off sticking it out in their current job rather than quitting in the hope of finding a better salary elsewhere. That the worst paid workers are now seeing weaker wage growth than their better paid counterparts for the first time since really 2015 does seem pretty K-shaped. You can also see a K-shape if you look at asset prices. The two big asset classes for most Americans are property and stocks. As you probably already know, the US stock market has done pretty well recently, with the S&P 500 rising by 16% in the year to date, at least at the time of writing, and 84% in the past 5 years. But property's also done pretty well in the past couple of years, with US house prices rising by more than 50% since 2020. This has all been great news for people who own either stocks or property, but pretty terrible news for anyone who doesn't, especially because wages have only grown by about 30% in the same time. Things look even worse when you factor in inflation. Prices have risen by 25% in the past 5 years, which means that real wages have been essentially flat, while asset holders have continued to enjoy a real terms increase in their wealth. This creates a sort of K-shape between people who own assets, which have appreciated markedly, and those who don't, who've had most of their wage growth wiped out by inflation. This isn't quite the same as a divide between rich and poor. Quite a lot of poor people, for instance, own their own homes, especially older generations, but it can make the economy feel pretty K-shaped for those who don't. Ultimately, perhaps the most acute K-shape in the US at the moment is about prospects. Rich Americans are looking forward to solid wage growth and strong asset appreciation, while poorer asset-less Americans, who only a couple of years ago were enjoying strong wage growth, their choice of job, and at least hope that rising interest rates would finally bring down property prices, are now looking at precarious employment with meagre real wage growth and ever-rising property prices. Now, that's quite a lot of information we've thrown your way, and that's after we've simplified it down for you. So you can only imagine how overwhelming it is to sift through the hundreds of outlets reporting on it online to just find out what happened. Luckily for all of us, there's a website and app that collects all those articles and puts them all in one easy-to-access place. And that website is, you guessed it, Ground News. Not only does Ground News assemble all these articles, but it also offers a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each individual source, giving you the opportunity to dive deep into the information that may have been hidden from you previously. For example, if we take this story on the K-shaped economy, we can see that there are 83 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the centre. If we use their handy bias comparison feature, we can see that the left highlights inequality and the right treats the label as descriptive. We can also filter and sort every story by their factuality level, helping you to easily grasp the reliability of each outlet. Or even take a more extensive look at who owns each of these outlets, keeping you fully informed on who's trying to feed you information online. Even if you want to stay close to home and explore what's being said in your area, Ground News can break down all of your local news, and even shows you stories you might have missed, introducing you to their blind spot feature. Here you can discover everything that's being disproportionately reported by one side or the other, whether it's a mile from your house or on the other side of the world. That's just scratching the surface of what Ground News has to offer. So if you're interested, there's no better time to sign up, as we're partnering with them to offer 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. And just in time for the holiday season, you can even gift a subscription to a friend or family member for the same 40% discount. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description, go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.